No. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to this wonderful event and very topical, unfortunately, event co-organized by the ETUI and FES. The title of this event is Understanding Right-Wing Populism, and no less importantly, what to do about it, because there's clearly something to be done about it. So we have a great parterre. It's great to see you all, but we also have a fantastic lineup of speakers, all great friends of the ETUI, the labor movement. We have the two presenters of this important report written for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. They are the authors, Professor Daphne Halikopoulou, sitting right beside me, and next to her, Professor Tim Blandas. Daphne is a professor of comparative politics at the University of Reading, on her way to the University of York. I've just discovered Tim is associate professor of comparative social policy at Oxford University, a fellow at St. Anthony's College. He has joined us on a number of initiatives about this topic. It's a pleasure to welcome you back here. And then we will hear, after the presentation, we'll hear from Julian Baer, head of trade union policy at ETUC, and Agnes Jongerius, member of the European Parliament for the Socialists and Democrats, extremely active on this front, with a background as a trade unionist and an activist. It's a pleasure to have you both here with us. So without further ado, I would give the floor to the authors of this copious report. You can find it freely available on the website of FES and also on the website of the ETUI website advertising this particular event.
Marvelous. Thank you so much. Let me just make sure. So I just arrow here, and yeah, fantastic. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for your interest in our work on far-right populism. So Tim and I will be alternating today in this discussion. What we want to do in this brief talk is four things. First, we're going to give you a bit the broader picture of the rise of right-wing populism or far-right populism in Europe. Second, we will present our argument about why this is taking place. And in a nutshell, what we're saying is that the rise of right-wing populism is not exclusively a cultural phenomenon, going against some of the literature that says that it is. Rather, it's a multifaceted phenomenon that has also a lot to do with economic insecurities. In order to substantiate this empirically, we're going to look at the three Ps, three different levels of analysis. We're going to talk a little bit about the demand side, so the people that support the parties, the supply side, i.e. the parties themselves, and what we do to attract voters. And finally, the policy level, what kind, which I guess is very relevant to all of you, what kind of policies we can put in place to address this phenomenon. And finally, point number 4 is we're going to look specifically at progressives and see, based on our empirical analysis, what can progressives do to address this phenomenon. So before I do any of that, let me very quickly just say that this work that you may have seen, by the way, it's available online. I don't know if we have any copies here. This report that we wrote, Ebert Stiftung, is not something new. It's actually based on a very long-standing collaboration that Tim and I have had. We've been working together for sort of almost 10 years now, and there is quite a lot of academic empirical work that we have published on some of the issues that we're going to talk about today. So I've got just some examples here. but essentially these all together culminate into this argument that at the demand side level, there are important economic insecurities that drive far-right party support, and that immigration itself is not simply, as much of the literature says, a cultural phenomenon. In terms of the supply side, we put forward this argument that political parties of the far right, posit nationalist solutions to various socioeconomic problems to get support. And of course, the policy level, specific labor market policies actually mitigate the insecurities that prompt voters to support the far right. So if you are interested in any of these, they can be found online in academic sources. But let me start here with the big picture. I know we've all heard, oh, you know, wow, the far right is rising, or right-wing populism is rising. I spoke to some of you just before this event, and you told me about your specific country, you're concerned, and we have a very sort of cross-European audience. Now, in the report itself, we have covered 17 European countries. That's not because others, so you may not see your country. That's really true. And the reason that you may not see your country here is not that it does not have a far right, or that it's not interesting. Is simply because these are the countries that we covered in this report, but we'll be very happy to also discuss other countries that have it here. Now, what is interesting, again, you might tell me, well, some of you come from a country with a strong far right. You might say, oh, wow, it's been rising in votes. And others might say, well, I come from Greece, where actually the Golden Dawn, the neo-Nazi party that was in our parliament a few years ago, is now in prison for murder, grievous bodily harm, maintaining a criminal organization. And so really, if you look at it in terms of votes, the far right has declined. Recently in Sweden, we saw the Sweden Democrats really well. In Italy, Fratelli d'Italia also unfortunately did really well. So there is a picture in the countries that we're looking at of variation. Okay, not all these parties are doing equally well in terms of votes. There are some ups and downs. But if we look at the bigger picture across time, and this is what this graph shows you here, is that in fact, the rise of far-right populism has been happening. So there is an increase of these parties, specifically since the 2000s, and this has happened at the expense of both the center-right and the center-left. Now, what do I mean when I say success? Because again, you could look at me and tell me, yeah, but what success? The Golden Dawn is in jail, or what success? The Liga actually declined. So I think it's important to understand what we mean by success beyond just votes, because votes can go up and down. And ultimately, if I get 7% of the vote, does that mean I'm a very successful party? Does that not also depend on the electoral system? What does that mean? So I think beyond votes themselves that have increased in many countries, there are two other ways of measuring success. The one is that we see many of these parties enter government. Much more than before, these parties are now actually part of either a governing coalition or governing themselves, right? And this is newish. It's a much more accelerated trend. And I think it is worrying. While we discussed this a bit earlier, it is indeed true that a party in government moderates to an extent. Problem with that is also that a party in government is normalized. A party in government is seen as a party that is a normal player, a player that is legitimate in the system. And so the third problematic measure of success that is problematic is this so-called breakdown of the cordon sanitaire. These parties are successful because they are permeating mainstream ground. Now the ball is in their turf, right? So they are legitimate actors, they're perceived as legitimate actors, and everybody, believes, many parties even believe, that how do we address the far right? By copying the far right. The only way to imitate the far right is to become the far right. So beyond votes themselves, I would say that, or we argue in our report, that one of the most problematic and dangerous phenomena going on with the far right at the moment is that they have been legitimizing their positions, and they are perceived as mainstream actors. Now, how can we explain this indeed disturbing phenomenon in academic circles? Basically, that we know the conventional wisdom, or I'm sure it's not only academic, I'm sure we hear that a lot in the media, it's all about culture. In a nutshell, we hear it all the time. People are so fed up with immigrants, they're fed up with this cultural erosion that is going on, and therefore people are voting for the far right. As a result, as I said earlier, what should we do about it? Well, therefore, we really need to copy it. We really, even the left, in order to be successful, it must adopt some kind of culturalist argument that will help it fight the far right. How do we know this? How does this literature that argues this know this? Well, it knows because immigration is indeed a very salient issue. So if you look at barometers or other opinion polls, yes, immigration is important. We see as well that a lot of these voters for these parties have very strong authoritarian values. So again, they're willing to trade off some liberties for security, for cultural, autonomy, etc. And we see an increasing identification along the tan axis, or in other words, in simple terms, what that means is people are witnessing, or academics are observing rather, an emerging cleavage, not between the haves and the have-nots. They say this is yesterday's, but rather a new emerging cleavage between somewheres and the nowheres, between those with cosmopolitan values and those with nationalist values. However,
thank you, and thank you, dear colleagues, for joining us and taking the time, and for ETUI and for hosting us. I first came here 10 years ago as a visiting PhD, and it's always a pleasure to come back. So we disagree with conventional wisdom in a number of ways. Where we agree is that it's indeed the case that, it has to be the case almost automatically, that some latent demand in society must be attracted to a particular supply coming from the political system. So that has to be true on some level, but we think the conventional wisdom fails in three separate ways. One is that we don't think you can infer from the fact that racists are highly likely to vote for the far right, or people anti-immigrants are highly likely to vote for the far right. You cannot infer from this very strong correlation that we do find in the data almost everywhere, that the explanation for the phenomenon therefore has something to do solely with the presence of anti-immigrant attitudes or racism in society. For sure, these are present, and there's been present for quite some time, actually, in Europe in various kinds of ways. You need to look at the different groups that are mobilized in support of these parties, and why these different groups might have different kinds of motivations to be mobilized. Number one. Number two, what makes these parties especially palatable and attractive today is that they have rebranded themselves in a number of important ways. Number one, they increasingly try to pretend, if not in practice, at least in theory and appearance, that they are civic nationalists. In other words, the exclusion is not according to some intrinsic characteristic that you could ascribe to people, but it is presumed to be on some rejection of quote unquote liberal values that they suddenly would have become defenders of. So adoption of civic nationalism. Number two, they move from extremism to radicalism. Instead of saying we're going to undo democracy and put this benevolent dictator in charge, they now say, well, we're rejecting political institutions and established parties, they are terrible, but we are suddenly Democrats now. And number three, they've moved from the so-called winning formula for market liberalism in the 1990s. Taxes are bad. Think of Father Le Pen saying how much he loved Reagan and how much we had to cut the French welfare state in the 1980s, to a rebranded version from the daughter is now welfare chauvinism. I'm going to protect you if you are who I see as an insider, legitimate, sort of deserving of protection. People level, party level, but also policy level, that's less talked about in academic circles and I think in the media. And to the extent that it's talked about, it's only talked about in terms of let's close down borders. That is almost seen as the only policy that you can adopt to address the thing. So to the extent that there's a policy, it has to be a copycat policy. We think actually, no, if you come at it from a political economy or social policy background as I do, we know very well, and we were talking with a public health colleague early on, there's all sorts of risks in societies, and these risks are evolving, in some cases deepening and widening, and the policies that we have in place to address them, in many cases have been either not adapted to these new risks, or they've been retrenched in various kinds of ways since at least the 1990s, including in Scandinavia, right? So sometimes people say, why would social policies matter if you see the far right in Scandinavia? Well, I mean, Sweden of 1985 and Sweden of 2015 are not the same policy environment in terms of the protections that are affected to, that are targeted at the workforce. So people, party, policies. If we look at people, we across the 17 European countries in Europe, we try and model the probability that individuals with different kinds of characteristics vote for far-right parties across 17 European countries. I should say that you have quite a bit of variation across countries, but what comes from our data, you can see when it's orange, it's a positive association, when it's purple, it's negative, and when it's gray, nothing is really going on. You see the classic finding that male respondents are more likely to vote for the far right. People who are older up to a point, there's a bit of a generational effect here, are also more likely to vote for the far right. It peaks at 45, 55. In some countries, actually a bit older people, in other countries, actually a bit younger people, but overall across Europe, this is the age patterns. Medium to low level of education matters. People who are bottom income, actually on average in Europe in general, are not more likely to vote for far right, but in certain countries, it's certainly the case. Benefit recipients are not more likely as an average in Europe. But it is the case that certain occupational groups, people either in relatively low-skilled occupations, operators, in the countryside, agricultural workers, but also people, craft workers, people who used to have quite, or still do have specific skills, but work in industries that have faced all sorts of shocks, they're also more likely to vote for far right now. And then if we turn to attitudes, we do indeed find that there are immigration concerns, and people with immigration concerns are more likely to vote for far right. But these immigration concerns are not just about culture, they're also about economy and indeed public services and labor markets. And you find a traditional finding that Eurosceptics are more likely to vote for far right, for sure, across Europe as an average claim. People with authoritarian attitudes, strong men or strong women increasingly, and then people with religious practices. If we just, to give you a bit more of an intuitive finding here, for every country, we can calculate what makes you the most likely to vote for far right and what makes you the least likely to vote for far right. And just to give you an example, if I manage to read what's there, and if you do too, maybe you don't, let me just give you an example from here. In Germany, someone who has a 22% probability of voting for far right would be someone who's male, bottom income group, not a pensioner, in service, low-skilled occupations, not religious, distrust in European Parliament, high immigration concerns. If we turn instead to France, it's a male, the age loading is stronger around that age group, 65, 64. Remember, the early retirement schemes have been scaled back and pensions are under assault. Not a bottom income, bottom 10% income group, countryside, yellow vest, high immigration concerns, distrust in European Parliament, most likely. And in Sweden, most likely voter has these characteristics. In our data set, at least, this is not including the latest election, I should say. Yeah. Male, the unemployed, operator occupations, low to medium skills, they can be routinized. They don't have a high education level, high immigration concerns, distrust in the European Parliament. We could talk about other countries. We cover all these 17 countries in this way as well in the report. This is consistent with a large literature that shows that yes, anti-immigration attitudes, if you're highly anti-immigrants, you're more likely to vote for the far right. That's true. However, there is a problem in the inference that is drawn from this association. Typically, people conclude, therefore, anti-immigration explains the success, right? We think there's three problems with this use. One, immigration attitudes are not just a cultural phenomenon, right? There's all sorts of things going on to do with economy, restructuring. We know that sometimes people who are laid off in companies ascribe to immigration things that are actually due to trade shocks or automation or various other things that are going on in the workforce, so they misattribute what's going on, right? So it doesn't necessarily just have to be about culture. Two, you have lots of people who don't have cultural concerns over immigration, who have turned to far-right parties, right? And in some cases, in the most successful cases, the more successful the far-right parties, the more they have been able to capture other groups. 3, economic insecurity matters a lot. Let me just give you a hypothetical example to explain what sounds like a kind of nerdy, needlessly technical methodological point, but that actually has extremely important implications for debate. If you look here, what you find, suppose you have 110 people in your electorate. 10 have cultural concerns and 100 have economic concerns. This is an unhappy electorate, right? You see there's 10 times more people who have economic concerns in this electorate. 5 out of the 10 with cultural concerns, they vote for the far right. 50% probability. 10 out of the 100 with economic concerns vote for the far right, that's a 10% probability. I can run any statistical model on this I want. It's going to show me that cultural concerns have a more predictive power. Then the literature, and then the media, and in some cases politicians as well, conclude, well, it's about cultural concerns, right? Except that in the example I've just given you, you have twice as many people with economic concerns in the far-right electorate, but people with cultural concerns. So the inference we're drawing from the strong predictive power of the cultural concerns is completely misleading in terms of what's going on in the far-right party success. And then we have all sorts of, and that has implications for policy positions and party strategies and all sorts of things. So this matters quite a bit. This is the real data from the surveys we've used, 2002 to 2018, 17 European countries. You look at people who have declared voting for far-right party, and you can see that in different countries, the extent to which this electorate is anti-immigrant varies, of course. But 2 things are noteworthy. One, you see the gray bar here, people with no concerns at all about immigration. In some countries, are the majority of the far-right voters. And number 2, even in people who do have concerns, a lot of those concerns are actually economic. And as I said before, when people express economic concerns about immigration, they could be expressing all sorts of things that are not, in any case, a particularly automatically cultural, quote unquote, phenomenon.
Therefore, just to quickly sum up what Tim just said about the people level or the demand side level. Why is this important? Essentially, what this data shows is that far-right parties are successful because they have managed to extend their appeal beyond their secure voting base. Imagine this electorate that Tim showed you earlier. There is the core, and then there is the periphery. The core are those culturalists, as we call them, or those people that have strong cultural concerns over immigration. They are highly likely to vote for the far right, but they are few. They're actually not the majority of the electorate. So they may be galvanized, but they are a small group. What makes these parties successful, these percentages that we hear, 30%, 40%, 20, these cannot be from just capturing this small group of voters. It means that they have extended beyond their secure voting base to mobilize others whose concerns are economic, who are what we call the peripheral voters. So in other words, the far right has managed to forge a coalition of support between different types of voter groups that share some kind of insecurity, be it both cultural and economic. Now let's look at the supply side a little bit. How have they done that? It is also very important to understand how parties themselves appeal to different voters, right? Because that is part of the success recipe. Now, to address this question, we did 2 things. We looked at Marpor data, which is a database of party manifestos across time. And we also had the task of reading many of these manifestos ourselves and translating them to see how they put on different, how they make their case, basically. And essentially what they do, what the nutshell of our argument is that they, as I said earlier, now these parties have managed to put forward what we call nationalist solutions to all socioeconomic problems. So nationalism is not just simply something these parties say. It is the key justification for all their policy proposals. So what is your concern? Is it that the health system is not working? All right, party says, no problem, we'll get rid of immigrants. What is your concern? Is it that schooling for your children is not proper? No problem, we'll get rid of immigrants. What about your concern? Is it foreign policy? No problem, we'll get rid of immigrants. So they want nationalist solutions for every socioeconomic problem, which is why we see, for example, how can we measure this? In the Marpor data, we used the national way of life measurement, and indeed we see that both Western and Eastern European far-right parties emphasize the national way of life. But what I need to say here is that the way they do it has actually been very, very smart, because they use nationalism in a way that normalizes their position. So it used to be, take the Sweden Democrats as a great example, this effectively fascist party, right? What did they do? They purge all the extreme elements from the party. Marine Le Pen is the same, completely different from her father, distance themselves from fascism and put forward what we call a civic nationalist justification. So if, they no longer say we exclude people because they are racially inferior, because that is not a good thing to say. That's not going to get you your peripheral voters, is it? So now they say, no, we're not racist or anything like that. They say we exclude people because their intolerant ideological beliefs threaten our liberal democratic values. Now, I won't forget the manifesto of the FES SVP from about a decade ago that commenced with a preamble of a misquotation of Karl Popper about the boundaries of toleration. It started by saying, should we tolerate those who, if they were in our position, not tolerate us? So essentially shifting the boundaries of toleration to its head, really, and just saying all these intolerance, these Muslims who might be terrorists, these people who have to wear the hijabs and therefore violate women's rights or whatever, we need to exclude. Now, this is a smart and difficult discourse to defeat, right? Because all the peripheral voters, they say, fine, I'm not stigmatized. I'm not voting for a party that has the stigma of Nazism. I'm voting for a very normalized party that says something that feminists, that says something that, everybody shares as a concern. And this is how they've managed to also pin, you can see here as well, the Eurosceptic agenda, as we mentioned earlier. Now, I should say here that this is very much a feature of the Western European far-right parties, and there is a big distinction between West and East, Central and Eastern Europe in the party agendas. So the Central and Eastern European parties have more difficulty dealing with that because they haven't traditionally, they're not very plural societies, right? So they turned their discourse much more against LGBT communities, different types of minorities. So we see that the national way of life and this ethnic versus civic nationalism is very different in East and West. But you can see here as well, for example, this multiculturalism, how they use this just shows you the trend, but from reading the manifestos, how they really use multiculturalism actually as a way to promote themselves as the defenders of liberalism. So these intolerant parties present themselves as tolerant parties. Now, another interesting phenomenon that Tim was talking about earlier is they pin this sort of pseudo-liberal discourse together with increasing concerns about the citizens' welfare, right? So we see that progressively they have abandoned this free market policy that they used to have, instead saying now we support the welfare state, we support we support welfare state expansion. You can see here both East and West free market support has declined quite dramatically. And you can see again, there is in Western, I think the French case that we talked about earlier, for example, says it quite a lot. So Marine Le Pen has really gone very welfare chauvinist. Now, one thing I should say about this is that qualitative reading of the manifestos themselves shows that there's a lot of variation and the parties blur their positions because they also want to appeal to lots of different people. They say we support welfare for everyone, but they don't have specific policy recommendations in their manifestos. That's often because they can't, right? They do not own this issue. They don't know what kind of policies really. And this is in fact a weakness. They promote the idea, but specifically policy-wise, we don't have much to say.
Thank you. So, I realize we've been talking for 30 minutes. We just want to do two things before concluding. One is for me to just say just a few words about the policy environment, which is the third leg of our argument, and then for Daphne to conclude with our thoughts, but we're very interested in yours, obviously, as to on the basis of our reading of the evidence and what's been happening, what maybe progressives might want to do. So I think the first thing to say, and it's not said enough in my view, is that the general context here is one of secular economic stagnation. And it's been happening for a long time, at least since the 70s and 80s. We've never recovered. And if you look at the real growth performance across countries, and that's 30, 40 years, yes, there's ups and downs, you have recessions and booms, but by and large, the trend is downwards. And this has very significant implications. One, for worker insecurity and wage growth, and two, for welfare state, the ability of the welfare state to find the funds to address issues. And what it has done is that, on the one hand, partly pushed, I must say, also by some of the Lisbon agenda in the EU, there's been liberalization of the labor market. So workers' protections in the form of employment protection legislation, both for regular workers and temporary workers, both in terms of individual dismissals and in terms of collective dismissals. I don't need to go in details in the ETUI boom, I suppose, but it's been deregulated, and you really see it in the data, and it's really widespread and across the board. So you've got this rising contractual insecurity that has different expressions on the one hand. On the other hand, yes, social transfers have been increasing, and this is often discussed in the context of presumed or real debt pressures. But it's not increased just as much as the need that's been created, right? Because you had aging and unemployment remaining growing problems in most countries. And if you compare the two curves, you see, as it's seen here on the graph, but we haven't quite kept up with the needs that need to be addressed in terms of insecurity. Why does that matter? Just one slide on that. That matters because the probability that an individual votes for the far right if they're facing particular kinds of risks, think unemployment, is not independent of the policy environment, which for social policy and trade union practitioners and scholars is obvious but gets lost. If I'm unemployed and 20% of my wage is being replaced, it's not the same that if I'm unemployed and 80% of my wage is being replaced. This is widely accepted, but yet when we talk about the unemployed's probability of voting for far-right parties, this gets in the literature, is completely evacuated from the picture. Yet we find that the probability that an unemployed person votes for the far-right, or pensioner, or someone on sickness benefits, is a direct function of the policy environment, right? And so here, if this is a message maybe almost for the center-right parties more than for the left party, if you want to address the problem truly, you also need to support the policies that often the left is proposing in terms of addressing the insecurities that are in societies. Otherwise, you don't really want to address it. Which links us nicely to, the final thing. Thanks for bearing with us.
I'll be quick. What can we do as progressives to address this issue? Let me just explain our logic instead of just reading out the graphs here. So in order to answer that question, we need to look at also the center-left electorate. If we are a progressive party, it's not enough to just look at who votes for right, right, or who votes for others, but we also need to know who our core and peripheral groups are. Now, the key is to be able to broaden, again, to capture voters that the progressives are losing without alienating the core that they already have. And this is classic for any political party. So what have we done? We have looked, to start with, the same probabilities, what makes a particular voter vote for the far right. We've looked at the same for the center-left. Who is the center-left electorate? Now, as you can see here, I'm not going to linger too much. These are the more objective characteristics. There are some overlaps, but broadly speaking, this is a different electorate. Yes, in terms of certain objective characteristics, but more so in terms of the subjective, in terms of the attitudinal characteristics. The center-left voters are very different compared to the far right or populist right voters in terms of their economic and cultural concerns over immigration. And this is very important. And now we can see this even better if we look at the distribution, what we talked about, the composition point, the distribution of these concerns among these electorates. And we've broken it down to both Eastern and Western Europe for clarity, but we also have the full number as well. What does this graph tell us? This graph tells us that the core, if you like, center-left electorate The vast majority of it has no immigration concerns at all. Those that do have immigration concerns are by far economic, sort of the so-called culturalists, or in other words, the secure voting base of the far-right parties, the core of the far-right is not the same at all as the core of the far-left. Now, what does that mean? That means that if the center-left tries to copy the far-right by adopting culturalist policies, it will likely alienate its core constituency. It might gain a few voters, but it will lose many of its secure voters. Now, this is not something that only us are saying. There was a recent interesting study on the AfD and the German electorate that found exactly the same thing, looking at the elections in particular, right? So you're going to leak out those voters who really don't want any strict immigration positions, and you're going to gain a few more peripheral voters initially, and in the end, it'll only be a very short-term phenomenon. So what does that mean?
Well, co-optation doesn't work, right? I think is our message. Address insecurity, but without co-opting the core message of the far right. So you have to get at the insecurity, but you can't propose, I mean, the solution to fight nationalism, and it sounds almost too obvious to state, but it's gotten lost often, cannot be to adopt nationalism, right? Which seems to be some of the conventional wisdom out there. But you do need to address the insecurities and grievances that are there, right? And you need to do so in a way that you don't alienate your core electorate in trying to recapture what is the periphery of the far right, right? So it's about striking a kind of middle road where you address the insecurities, but without co-opting the strategy. And with that, we'll stop. Thanks for bearing with us.
Thank you. Extremely stimulating. I'm sure that there will be a lot of comments and questions from the floor. First, let's listen to some comments and perhaps remarks from Julian and Agnes.
Thank you very much. First of all, for the invitation. Well done to you, Nicola, and the team, and the Friedrich Stiftung to organize this event. And thank you very much to the two experts for their great presentation. And don't apologize for the length of it. It was really, really interesting. Starting with a general comment before more specific comments, I think that unfortunately this event is organized in a very timely manner. So it is clearly a priority for the ETUC to fight against the far right, to counter the narrative of the far right, and it's really a question, an issue that we have on the table right now. I just said organized in a timely manner. Why? You know that this event coincides more or less with a very sad anniversary of what happened to the TGL headquarters last year, where there was an anti-vax demonstration happening, and the fascist movements participated to that demonstration and used this opportunity to enter in the TGL offices and destroy the offices. So, and last weekend, our colleagues from Italy organized a big demonstration, as well as events linked both to the fight against the far right and to the reply to the crisis of the cost of living. And it's exactly the two things that you addressed in your report, organized in a timely manner as well because of the elections and the results we had in Sweden, in Italy. I could also mention France. Even if Macron was elected, you can see that in the parliament, it's an historical number of Front National MPs that we have now in France as well. So just to give these three illustration, and of course the cost of living crisis, and it's only the beginning. It's only the beginning, and you really well demonstrated the importance to reply to this cost of living crisis, and the fact that if we don't do it, we will have also concerns about let's say the increase of voters in the far right. And last element about the timely moments, really your report and especially your recommendations give food for thought on how to be ready to face the European elections. So I'm sure that Agnes will address that, but also from a trade union point of view. And I'll add my comments with a question to you about that. So I would like to comment almost all your slides. I will do it. I don't have time, but so I limit myself to 3 comments and I've promised a question. So the first one is about what you said on the concerns of the people and your analysis. I think that it looks obvious after looking at all the data and your presentation was so clear, but I have to say that it's also what from the trade union side we also saw and witnessed. Last week we were in the European Parliament. We organized a demonstration in front of the Parliament in Strasbourg, and Agnes was there. Thanks a lot again, Agnes, for your support in that context. And then we had an event where we invited workers from different origins to give testimony. So there was a policeman from Romania, there was a cleaning lady from Belgium, a worker in the agriculture sector, and they all said the same. Our concern, and here I will read what you wrote by page 45, job security, working condition, employment risks, equal opportunity, housing, health access. This is exactly what they said. So right now, with the cost of living crisis, we really face difficulties. We really face insecurity in that context, and of course, we need to reply to that. The same message basically from them. It cannot go on like this, and we can't pay the price of the crisis. So it leads me to the second comment. So talking about the concerns, but talking now about how to reply to these concerns. And that was also an element very interesting of your report, because if we don't reply to that, the far right will do it. The far right will occupy that space, will occupy the workplaces, will occupy the streets as well. And that's also an element that we saw that more and more far right political parties occupy our space, the street, to demonstrate and to push for their ideas. And to counter that, we have just launched in September a big campaign on the cost of living crisis, where we say basically our slogan: increase wages and tax profits. And we have developed 6 demands that we, of course, presented also last week in Strasbourg. And we use these 6 demands because of the image of the Rubik's Cube, because it's a very complex issue, and we really need to address all the dimensions of it. We can't fix only one side, we really have to fix all the sides. And by that, we have these 6 demands. So, I'm sure you know them, or you share them, maybe, I hope. So that the fact that pay rises need to meet the increase of the cost of living, that we need the payments to be targeted for people struggling to afford their energy bills, to put food on the table, to pay the rent, price caps, national crisis support. I'm thinking about sure measures. We need to reform the functioning of the EU energy market, and last but not least, we also need trade unions at the table to address all these issues. So that's my second comment. So we have identified the concerns. We need to reply to them, and we need a plan to do so. Having said that, I would like now in my third comment to talk a bit more about the role of the trade unions, and the fact that we also have a key role to play. And that's why also we have launched this campaign, but not only. Last year, we have adopted what we call the roadmap to fight against the far right. Some colleagues are key members to help us to support here in this room this roadmap. And we have 15 actions. So actions that focus on communication, on training, also on surveys, as you just did today, but also on negotiations, on collective bargaining, and on how to adapt policy vis-a-vis the far right. And I would like to mention 2 examples of things that we did. We looked at the collective agreements, interprofessional, sectoral level, and also company level. And we saw that also more and more our affiliates include in their own collective negotiations this dimension of not necessarily fighting against the far right, but including the promotion of equal opportunities at the workplace, action against racism and any form of discrimination, and of course the topic of the fight of the cost of living crisis. That's one action that we developed in that context. We have also adopted in June this year with our executive committee a policy vis-à-vis our relationship vis-à-vis the parliament. And here we adopted a very clear position where we say that basically we talk to the 5 democratic pro-European political parties, independent MEPs, which are not linked to the far right, no relationship with our group, unless, and there is an exception if they are chair of a committee, no relationship with ID, and also possible relationship with non-attached MEPs, which are independent. So for us, that was also a strong political step that we adopted vis-à-vis the far right. And last but not least, in that context, I was mentioning the 6 points demand that we developed to respond to the crisis, but that's one element of it. And I can tell you that right now we will mobilize against the crisis, and that's also for us our way to respond to what you say and how to act. I took with me I printed it that we coordinate also actions from the national level. And here in 2 months, I already have 5 pages of national actions, sectoral actions of our affiliates, more or less 100, all of them saying the same thing, that the workers can't be the victim of the crisis, and that we need to increase wages and tax profits. And of course, the ETUC will go on with that, and we will escalate our actions. So I'll stop here for the comments. I promise to finish with a question, because when I was listening to you, I was remembering a conversation that I had with some friends, some trade unionist friends, and we were talking about how to prepare ourselves also for the European elections, and how to, because usually we look at the manifesto, you refer to that as well, the programs, and usually we have a kind of toolbox, a checklist of just to help the workers to see what's in line with our values, with solidarity, with social justice, with really the concern we have, and not this narrative of division and hate that the far right has. And then the colleagues from said, don't do that this time. If you do that, you may have the answer that you don't want to have, is that the far right will exactly the point of them to see in their program. And I was like, oops. Yes, indeed, and that's in fact the question I wanted to ask you. What advice would you give us about how to deal with that now, because of the evolution that you very well explained in your presentation? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. The word European elections and European Parliament has been mentioned a couple of times. I think that's I
noticed it.
Perfect cue to bring in Agnes.
Thank you. And my first remark is, of course, that I'm so sad that the Netherlands is not included in the study, because yes, I'm a member of the European Parliament, but I'm representing the Dutch voters and the Dutch Labour Party in the European Parliament. And let's say we have some experience with even more than one right-wing party. And I think the lessons you have drawn from the different data, I think I could use them for the Netherlands too, in debating also our strategy in the campaign towards first, we will have provincial elections in March next year. I don't know how long Mark Rutte is keeping his cabinet. Perhaps we have national elections even earlier, but of course we also have European elections, and there I think some lessons can be drawn from your study. So great work, and ETUI, thank you for putting this on the agenda and on the timely issue of this study. Is also has been mentioned, although I think there should also be this debate about, let's say, Sweden, the extreme right one, but our sister party also won. But because they didn't were successful or as successful in making a progressive coalition, the other coalition is bigger. So this is also about how are we behaving in building a progressive majority in the different election campaigns. And that's something I think we should also consider, perhaps not in response to this study, but here I think there is something at stake too. We should be, as a progressive answer, see who are our progressive friends, and of course, my background. The trade unions are our party, but there are also other political parties. For instance, the Greens, for instance, the people from the left, where perhaps we are not having the complete same manifesto. But if we are talking about, let's come up with a response to the normalizing of extreme right, and you should also think about power building, building a progressive alliance to counterattack that. I don't want to do this. That's not exactly people or party. It's also not exactly policies. So perhaps you can think of a fourth P for this, because I think we need to do this. But I think foremost, and I do agree with Julian here. Of course, we have the story of the extreme right, but we also have the fact that we don't have our story straight. So if you say they are going to be in the place where we were and introducing our policies, I do recognize this also from the Netherlands. If you look at the party manifesto of Geert Wilders, the longest existing extreme right party in the Netherlands, it's very much on how to protect our welfare system. And indeed, with the subtitle, we could do this if we didn't have these immigrants. But if you read what they're talking about, writing about unemployment benefits or pension systems, it could be classical social democratic policy, but it could also be classic social democratic policies, because we left the room for them. Not only them coming in our space, it's also the other way around. We were still, let's say, in a way drawn in this third way rhetorics. So let's see if we can use market powers to in perhaps this sad story about if we grow the pie, everyone gets a little bit more of the pie, and how do we grow the pie by introducing more free market system. This is, and I think we are among friends here, so I can make this remark. We vacated the space which extreme right is now occupying, and in a way, I think our answer should be with self-conscience, self-confidence, and with alliances, we should fight back for our own turf. And this is, for me, when we're talking about what would be the answer, I think we should indeed, like you have in your data, not focus on the wrong issues. Of course, the cultural issues are always difficult, also in the circles of our parties and also in the circles of the trade unions. But if, for instance, I make an example from the Netherlands, we have a big shortage of social housing, affordable housing, rental housing, and also houses people can buy. And that has been a deliberate policy. So the social housing traditionally had quite big time, has been sold to the market, to big investors, to the BlackRocks of this world. The space in cities which are available are given or handed out to, let's say, market-driven developers. So a ordinary working couple, let's say the policeman and the nurse, they cannot buy a house in the city anymore where they are invited to work. They cannot rent a place because the rents are too high for their paycheck. And if then at the same moment we have not a real crisis, but a created crisis with asylum seekers, then the let's say the easy story or the simple story is you cannot get a house because we have to accommodate all the asylum seekers. While the story should be we introduced too much markets. We reduced our social housing and therefore now everyone is fighting for the same place under the sun. And I think telling this story is a key. And I think when talking about the European election, it can be done. We also saw that in the previous commission, Jean-Claude Juncker made use of the fact that everyone was stirred and shaken about the Brexit referendum and the first round in which Le Pen entered the second round, so 4 years ago, to introduce quite a lot of social legislation. So he thought, okay, I cannot ask for support for the European project if people think Europe doesn't do anything for me. So we got legislation on protection of people working in unsafe labor conditions. We got the protection of labor migrants. We got the directive on work-life balance, on transparent and predictable working conditions, and so things changed because people were thinking, okay, how do we get support? Now, at the moment, you sometimes noticed that, let's say, people are saying that the Juncker Commission was the social commission, and now it's about green and digital, and okay, we have an energy crisis on our hands. And I think our answer should be social wasn't something luxury we do at Sunday and then go back on Monday again. But we should really put this in the focus. And I think this is the only answer. We should reclaim our space. We should build coalitions. We should indeed talk about the insecurities on economic conditions people face. And we could also make use of the example, let's say, during the COVID crisis, you and I, we were able to sit behind our laptop. But society was kept afloat by the people who drove the parcels to our houses, to the hospitals, to people in the agricultural sector. And yes, all these invaluable workers are also the ones with the lowest paycheck. So I think we should build from that, and should build from the minimum wage, should build from indeed, you cannot say leave no one behind without putting policies on the table. And yes, I think we should learn and be smart about extreme right. I think the real answer is what are we doing ourselves in building coalitions, being bold in our demands, and then indeed there are some people who believe that copying these cultural issues leads to success, but I think there is no proof of that on on the different elections days, so we are on our own. And the only thing I was like thinking about from your presentation, the remark you made on this cordon sanitaire. I know there has been always difference between the different member states. Do we do a cordon sanitaire or don't we do a cordon sanitaire? I'm not convinced, me personally, that it's helpful to have a cordon sanitaire, because it's in a way giving this too easy way out of complaining of this are the elites and we are left behind, we are out of the circle. But if you think this is a successful policy, please convince me.
Thank you very much. You have already received quite a few comments and at least two very, very important questions. But may I ask, if you don't mind, our audience, both in this room and the nearly 100 people that are following us online, to share any questions with us, either through the Q&A facility or by raising your hands, and please introduce yourselves.
Good afternoon. Thank you much. Thank you very much for the report and for the very interesting debate. I'm Karin de Bruyne. I'm from the Belgian Union CSC. So my first question is to the professors. Your research findings seem to run a little bit counterintuitive to what we see, for instance, the success of the Danish Social Democratic Party, who seems to be addressing issues like anti-immigration policies. We see a little bit the same in my region, Flanders, where the Social Democratic Party has been going up in the opinion polls of late and is combining addressing economic securities with a more critical attitude on immigration. So an answer to that, and then maybe a question to ETUI or possibly also Julian. Do we have a mapping of the trade unions on how they deal with radical rights? Because one thing is obviously we adopt it all together in the ETUC resolution, but doesn't necessarily always respond on what they are doing at a national level. And perhaps on one issue, one question to Agnes. It seems to me like one crucial issue is Europe there, because, for instance, extreme right in my country, Vlaanderen, they're in favor of a national minimum wage. They voted against the European minimum wage. So there seems to be something really crucial aspect there. And if there are any thoughts of you or other members of the panel on that issue as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's the gentleman there.
Thanks very much. That was really fascinating. My name is Luke, and I'm a trainee in the workers group in the European Economic and Social Committee. And I was just wondering, firstly, to what extent do you think anti-immigration sentiment can be elite-led rather than politicians simply kind of meeting a demand from voters? And also, I was just wondering why you might think in certain circumstances, voters who might have dual economic and cultural demands, why they're kind of more persuaded by a left-wing or far-left solution and they turn to right-wing and anti-immigrant solutions instead.
Thank you. Thank you. Sylvia.
Yeah, thank you. Well, extremely interesting. Thank you for the presentation. Well, I work here at the ETUI and I'm Italian, so I know a bit how it feels to. And I was quite happy that Agnes mentioned the fact that somehow, forgive me if I rephrase it, the left has somehow a sort of crisis of identity crisis. This is my impression, and I could sense that in the Italian landscape, where of course I would vote on the left, but I did it with a sort of disgust, honestly, because the programs were, I didn't recognize a leftist program in the parts that should represent the left. And then I was wondering if in your study you have noticed this. I mean, when the program does not reflect traditional leftist values, or the program somehow is party somehow too close to the market economy mentality, is there that the vote drift toward the far right? I mean, is this how pinpoint this identity crisis?
Any other questions to see, Sarah, and then the gentleman? Yes.
Thanks very much. Hi, I'm Sarah King, and I work in the workers group at the Economics and Social Committee in the Secretariat, so with Luke. And again, my thanks to all of you. Yeah, very interesting and rich discussion and lots of information. Two sort of, yeah, questions, reflections. I mean, of course, here we're talking about the role of trade unions, but I wonder as well, what can we do in terms of the role of business and employers? Because if we look at the landscape in terms of what's happening in terms of, you know, people's employment conditions and all the rest of it, you know, of course, you know, the employers are pushing, they want maximum flexibility, you know, they want to outsource all forms of risk, whether it's to the worker themselves or to, you know, society more generally. But, you know, what is, you know, in terms of getting them to come back to, I think, what the I2C and E2C are calling the social contract, to say that actually, you know, you guys, you know, as businesses, as employers, you also have a role in helping us to address these issues, because if you don't, it's actually also going to have an impact on them. So that was just one aspect. And the other aspect was to do with democracy in the far right. And I think Julianne mentioned in terms of the work that ETUI-FES is doing in relation to the parliament and the parties that, you know, we work with, and the parties that, you know, we consider to be undemocratic. But as we know, I mean, we've mentioned the recent examples. At the end of the day, a lot of these parties that do have their base, their foundations in fascism, are being normalized and are being elected through the democratic process. And okay, there's an intellectual discussion about that, but how do we actually bring that, how do we address that issue, you know, as trade unions, but also as, you know, members of civil society, you know, who have our concept of what we think of as democracy, which is, you know, rights, equality, and all the rest of it. But we face a phenomenon where these people are being, you know, democratically elected. And of course, we all know the history, you know, that we can also sort of refer to. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take one last comment or question, if I may, so as to give a chance to us speakers to reply, and then we can take a few more.
Okay. Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Maurizio Tinerello. I'm from the University of Ghent, but also an independent researcher on matters of capitalism, political consciousness, and artificial intelligence. And I got two small questions, I think. One is, do you think that the European far right is, I don't know if you have worked on that, but is trying to copy as much as possible the Republican Party in the US, where now the Ku Klux Klan rhetoric is part of the mainstream, well, so-called Republican Party, MAGA, whatever you want to call it. Are they trying to do the same? I think you talk a bit about capturing the liberal view. On the other one, perhaps it is a bit wider, is that it seems to me that both the far right and what progressive, as you call them, or Agnes pointed out that we have a failure of discourse, are working within the same ideological constraints that underpinning political economic system, which is capitalism and its ideology. So if we can only bring back some decent jobs, some good paying jobs and so on, I mean, aren't we just delaying until the next, you know, sort of socio-political economic crisis? So, okay, we're going to do this, but what you know, as progressive, I don't like that word, but as what is the step further? Are we just continue to embrace social liberal capitalism, or, you know, how can we break that? That's the question of the 21st century, of course, for our survival, I think. So I don't know if, I'm sorry to have
and also, so there's really a lot of interest obviously generated, and Shall we just go through the speakers in the order they sitting next to me in order to get the replies?
Okay, let me start. I think a lot of the questions are, and some of the comments, they sort of they build on each other. So I will address many in the same response, starting with you on the parties you mentioned, but also actually addressing Agnes's spot on comment, I think, about where the left is. So just as a disclaimer, to start and say that to do a comparative study of very diverse countries and very diverse parties is not easy, right? So we're not suggesting that there is a one size fits all. There are significant variations, both in terms of the demand and in terms of the supply. Having said that, I'm a comparativist by training, and I think that drawing patterns is important. So, for example, in the Danish case, I think that we do have some data in the report that shows that there isn't as much of a switch as you would expect. So I do think that that is a bit overblown. That the fact that, you know, obviously, as I said, different cases are different. We don't cover Belgium, but from Denmark, I do think, and also you need to also see the distinction between long-term and short-term success, right? So you may capture a voter in the short term, but how loyal is that voter going to be in the long term if, as you said very nicely, you lose ultimately the values that you represent? Now, I think actually Agnes really nailed it when you talked about, you know, how we are being, I would put it in maybe a different word. I think the problem is that the left is being defensive, right? So it's just it's like a football team playing on the other team's turf and losing, and you're 3-0, right? And you're like, I'm losing morale and I'm losing identity, and I don't know what I should support and what values I should put forward, right? And then the sort of the initial idea is, let me copy. Let me copy. But I think if you do that, if we do that, then we really lose the values that we start with. And from a completely instrumental point of view, I think that is unconvincing. Because in a way, if the far right is drawing the left in a turf that it does not have what we call in political science ownership of, we're going to lose, right? No matter how many cultural policies the left might implement, it doesn't have ownership. It's not credible that it can address them in the way that they would want. Instead, I think that the answer is to go on the offensive, right? The answer is, and I think, again, you said that in a way, what we need to do is actually claim ownership of what we can deal with. We have systematic policies that can help people. Systematic. We have ownership and we have knowledge. We have experience. We have credibility. And instead of pushing them, you said, about Belgium, yeah, sure, some of these parties, they do have some proposals about, minimum wage and other, but I don't think that they are particularly credible. They don't have many of them don't have office experience, and they don't have systematic policy knowledge. That is where I think they can be, that is the turf I think they can be fought on, rather than a turf that is just not ours to claim.
Thank you.
Thank you for these very stimulating comments from the discussants and the audience. I think indeed there's a couple of interrelated themes, but I think I would start in a way from the last one, which raises the broader question that the left, in fact, also from the colleague here, that the left is bringing together traditions, even the 50s and 60s, that are not unified on the state market dimension. So that's the starting point. You have people who say, okay, all this tinkering around capitalism, this is not the bigger issue here. And you have people who essentially want to keep markets, but want to attenuate things and think that they're forceful progress within certain conditions. So that's the first compromise, right? But against this compromise, you then have social structural change of the left electorate. And paradoxically, it's because of its success, because the welfare state and the left program brings about growth. That creates a middle class, social cultural professionals that has aspirations that depart from other parts of the left in additional way to the state market axis, right? So you have the state market axis having a more kind of societal axis, right? And then we get the globalization shock third dimension, right? So we have a problem of composing with these different elements, the coalition building, spot on, I agree, right? How do we do that? Then there's the question of, and it was alluded to both here and in the room, of the quote unquote, as my colleague Lenka Bostikova said in an event yesterday within Oxford on the same report, but she studies Eastern Europe. She said, original sin of left parties in Eastern Europe, they're going to struggle to re-own the welfare state issue. In the Western European countries, there is a bit of a more minor original sin, the third way, right? It's not as dramatic, but yes, there has been a loss of voters. To the far right, to a small extent, abstention is very big, and other forms of parties of the left that are outside the traditional coalitions, right? So we've bled three kinds of ways the voters: abstention is far left, and to a small extent the far right, right? And then that brings me to the question of I think the trade unions, which almost sits in a pivotal role in this complex reshuffling, because for sure they provide an ideational interpretation of what's going on, but we have lost it. You know, if you have workplace issues, the unions used to provide a reading of what was going on, right? So almost a kind of Trumpian hegemony there, right? But also, yes, I mean, we know that historically trade union members were less likely to go to the far right. They were also very active in all sorts of other ways, and bargaining, coverage, and workplace democracy, echoing some questions about democracy. Yes, democracy in general, but also workplace democracy. I think that was very, very important. But we need to reoccupy what we vacated. I noted this, that we vacated a space that needs to be reoccupied. Can we do so by copycatting strategies? The evidence on average across Europe is that you have two effects in a way. You have a legitimation effect and a kind of substitution effect. And so substitution effect is, if I talk about immigration and you're obsessed about immigration, maybe I bring you back to me. But I also legitimate the topic. And once the topic is legitimate, that benefits the actor that has greater ownership, right? On average, right? Some parties are more or less able to do it, but I think it's a dangerous ground. I mean, I know I haven't addressed everything, but hopefully I've answered some of the comments.
Okay, I also don't know if I can address everything, but I think, and then I'm trying to build on the comment you made. I think we live in interesting times, not only because what's happening in this aspect, but you also see that, let's say, the old paradigms of the last 2 decades are crumbling also quite easily. So we have France with a liberal president, so the prime minister, with a liberal president who is nationalizing his energy company. Same is happening in Germany. For instance, on this issue of buying vaccines, the European Union doesn't have any, let's say, tasks in this, in the Treaty of Europe. And still, okay, there is this need, so let's go ahead. And I think this is, in that sense, let's say, an invitation to also, on the one hand, get rid of this, let's say, this old dichotomy of should it be Europe, should it be the member states. In every European elections before in the Netherlands, it was always about, is it Europe or is it the member states? Well, I think now we are in this narrative in which we can say, if I can help push for a higher minimum wage from the European level in my own member states, why shouldn't I do it? And yes, I know that the NVA took a stance again, but I also noticed, for instance, that the people representing the Macron party in the European Parliament supported my directive. Mm-hmm. So there is this, there is much more and there is more possible, and there is not this fast. You're either this or that, and I think we can make use of that. And it's also dangerous because this, like what I said before, the Juncker Commission was the social commission. Now it's now Monday again. Let's start working. For instance, like I heard that, for instance, the OECD is now warning that member states should not raise their minimum wage because this is bad for the economy. We are not there yet. So there is change possible more than there has been, let's say, in the decades before. But we also have to fight harder and be more bold with our solutions. Perhaps that's then the coincidence with your story. I think we should tell our own story. Shouldn't forget someone else's story, because that's also no one gets better from copying someone else, because then you want the real thing instead of the copy. But it's time indeed to come back in the offensive, and it can be done because things which has not been possible for a very long time, nationalizing energy companies, is possible now, and I think it's also clear that if Europe wants to keep the support of workers, ordinary people, also for fighting this war, the Ukrainian border. You now see the first demonstrations where working people are putting up signs saying, let's get rid of the sanctions against Putin because we are going to pay the price. It's a serious signal that these demands, although I never have been able to do this Rubik's Cube, and also I hate the image of the Rubik's Cube. But if we don't take this seriously, it's also possible that we lose support for the European projects, for the fight in Ukraine, for the green and digital transition, which is needed to have a sustainable economy. And that perhaps means working hard. But I think everyone here in the room is willing to work hard for the good cause. And with an eye on the good cause, I have to leave the meeting and go back to the parliament. Yeah, to another good cause. So, if you don't mind.
That also gives me a chance to read a couple of questions that have cropped up in the hope on the Q&A facility, in the hope that I might have some text. One is actually two of them have to do with the young people, children in education. What is it that we're doing as trade unions, collectively as societies, to make sure that they're not the target of a far-right ideology? And there is also a question linked to that about, some things might be changing with the young anymore. They used to be the most progressive segments of society. I like to think they're still progressive, but perhaps they're now there's more diversity and perhaps more polarization. And the other one is about climate transition. The link, okay, in the long run, but also in the short run, the yellow vest. And I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on top of the many questions I have been addressed directly to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicola. No problem. So I will start with two comments on about the questions that some of you have addressed. So one from Sarah about the role of the employers. And I can't agree more on that. In the context of social dialogue, this year we negotiated what's called the work program, which is basically a joint roadmap that we have together with the employers. And in the ETUI mandate, so I share a segment, we had in the list of our possible topics to discuss with them, the fight against the far right, and a possible joint action that we could have together. Nothing revolutionary, just talking about, you know, democracy at the workplace, equality at the workplace, representation at the workplace, elements which are of course linked to the importance of jointly fighting against the far right by dealing it in this way. The reply was, go, forget it. And that was really a big disappointment from our side, because we thought that indeed that would be also the right moment for a joint signal together with the employers. So we won't abandon, and we will of course go on with that. But just to reply to your question about that. How do trade unions deal with the far right? So I don't have a kind of exhaustive mapping of the possible replies, but I think that there are several questions. So the first one is, do our trade unions have policies, or do they add in their own constitutions or statutes something linked to the fight against the far right? Yes, some of them. Some of them have even, you know, an entire article about how they approach their relationship together with the far right, and that was for us, sorry, the source of inspiration for our resolution, how to also what to do for the ETUC at European level. So some of them yes, some of them no, about including that in their policies. Some of them have also in their statute the possibility to exclude members who are active as you know, a national member, for example, at the same time being a force ouvrière member. No, that's for some unions that's not possible, and they simply exclude these workers' representatives. Another aspect on how to deal with the far right in the context of negotiations. And on this, in the project that we had about, you know, these new frontiers of negotiations, what we saw is that our members do not deal with the far right within their agreement directly, but more about replying to the concerns that the workers have, and by focusing about the equality aspect and, you know, equal opportunities at the workplace, and also the actions against racism and any form of discrimination. So that's about the trade union. How do trade unions deal about the far right? Now, thank you very much for the questions about young people, because indeed we had an entire workshop about that. Because what we saw, and this we were helped by our colleagues from Belgium, what we saw also is that the far right is very well organized to target young people, especially via social media. And this is something that they are doing very good, very well, and that us as trade unions are not doing so well, to be clear. And that's linked also to how do we also, as trade union movement, recruit new members, especially young people, who are now, as you rightly say in your report, vulnerable workers on the labor market. So with all these concerns of insecurity, how do we reach them? And that's really a challenge for us, because you know, it's not only about, you know, what we have to do, it's about how to approach them, how to meet them when they join, you know, sectors which are not very well unionized. And that's really a challenge that we have. And that's why we try to, you know, develop, and that's done at several levels, to target companies, to have, you know, recruitment strategies where we train our trade union delegates at all levels, especially to do that, and where we also try to change a bit our approach on, not on the values, but on the way to do it. Social media was referring to that, and that's certainly something where we should improve our way of reaching people, because what we saw in surveys is that very often the only way for young people to receive information is via social media. So if we're absent from social media, these young people who look for information only via this kind of networks, we lose them. So that's one reply that I could also give. And yeah, that was the last question about climate transition and the yellow vest. Yes, of course, and that's also, I mean, something that we shouldn't disconnect from the whole social dimension that was really present in our debate today. Is that, of course, this is also very important to fight for the environment, and not to oppose the two codes, but really to make them for us a double fight for the trade union movement. And that's certainly the message of the yellow vest as well.
Thank you, Julian. I sense that there are still a lot of questions and there's still a lot of comments that our speakers would like to do. But can I ask you, hold on to that energy for the next event that we'll organize on this important topic that it's not going to go away within a week. So more of this. Thank you very much. Thank you to our presenters, our discussants, Agnes, who just left. Thank you very much to the speakers. Sorry, to the audience, both online and in this room. It's great to see hybrid events working so well. It was great to hear from you all. Thank you. Until the next time.
And they still should. Substitute myself to the chair on this particular question.